Hey there, Golden Bears. Welcome back to Module 8-10, American Politics and Transition, essentially, Richard Nixon and his legacy. And our last time we looked at the rise of liberalism, where we saw Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson create these things called the Great Society. We're now going to talk about a president who wants to dismantle that Great Society and the Republican Party that is leading that cause. Talk about a tennis match, a ping pong match, back and forth, back and forth. Well, welcome to America and the political system of democracy. Here's a great quote that really helped accelerate President Nixon to the stage of receiving his presidency. He really was a staunch attacker of communism, and he was a staunch attacker of government programs that he felt were going way overboard. And he was also at this time trying to launch or at least convey that he was willing to get America out of this war called Vietnam that he did not start, but he will work hard to get out of. And so here's a quote. It says, "I say it's time to quit pouring billions of dollars into programs that have failed the United States of America, but for those who are able to help themselves, what we need are not more millions of welfare rolls, but more millions on payrolls in the United States of America." And so this quote, and along with Richard Nixon, really gained a lot of traction. Even those in the South who normally wouldn't have liked such rhetoric, but they were weary of seeing on the news media of a bunch of leftists and a bunch of new leftists and these countercultural people kind of take over America, and a court system that was they felt supporting more of the marginalized people groups with Earl Warren's court, and government spending that's gone amok. It made it relatively easy for a Republican to come on and say a few quotes and kind of gain the ticket that coalesced the Republicans both in the North and in the South, and even those on the West Coast. So that leads me to a story. I can remember in this time period, I was born in the great year of 1968. That tells you my age, and when tons of things were taking place. I'm really surprised any parents had children during those days, knowing the height of the Cold War, knowing of the major problems that were happening in America and abroad. And one such thing was these things called the gas lines that emerged in the mid-1970s. I can remember my family, we were traveling from H-Town up to Lake Tahoe, where our family had a cabin. And we would make that long trip up there in this old junky van that barely could make it out of Hemet, let alone make it the 10 plus hours up to there. So it was always an adventure not knowing where the van would go. But I can remember our first stop was Bishop, and it was there that my mom and dad were like, "Oh my gosh, look at these gas prices." And they were commenting on how just 2 years before gas prices were 35 cents and now they're staggering 77 cents. And I can remember them going back and forth throughout Bishop trying to find a gas station that was just 2 cents cheaper in order for them to go. And this was really not unknown. Well, our next stop was Bridgeport, which is probably a good couple hours away. And oh my goodness, they needed gas again because they needed to have the long push into Tahoe, and it was getting later, and so they knew there would be no gas stations between Bridgeport and basically Reno. And so there it went from 77 cents approximately to at least 84 cents a gallon, just because they knew they had everybody at their leisure and at their beck and call. And I can, it was very in 72 to 73, I was 4 or 5 years old, and I can kind of still remember this day the tightness of my parents' throat and looking at each other like, what are we going to do? And this is going to cut into our vacation, yada yada, all those things. But it was a very real time that Americans experienced this thing called OPEC that I'll talk about later, and how these oil-producing countries really cut off the valve of America's oil supply, which dramatically influenced the outcome of where America was then and continue is the America today, and our dependency on oil and what that means. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about Richard Nixon and how there's a return to conservatism, but then Richard Nixon gets himself in serious trouble because of the choices he and some of his counterparts make. And in this time, we experience this thing called stagflation that has never, ever existed before. In fact, they had to come up with a term to call it back then. And then we're going to finish up, because of Nixon's poor actions, we have Ford and Carter taking over the reins and dealing with a country and a foreign policies that are very, very hard and very confusing, to say the least. We'll leave this discussion for when we're in class. So with that, let us jump into the election year of 1968, the year of turbulence. It is during this time that you have tons of protests taking place. You have the Columbia University protests, where the police in New York came in and started, batting down on students for speaking up. You have Robert Kennedy getting assassinated, Martin Luther King getting assassinated. You have protests taking place. One of them in the Democrat National Committee takes place there in Chicago. What happens? The Chicago police show up by the hundreds and start beating people over the head with wooden their batons, and this is all captured on video. And this is just a capsule of the angst and the deep, profound sense that America was lost and wayward, and that America, this democratic idea, was not working. And so not only were these protests taking place in America, but you see global unrest taking place across the landscape of the globe. One of them, for instance, is in Prague, in Czechoslovakia. There, their premier, their president, if you will, basically says, I want to put a kinder face on socialism. And so they begin making changes in Czechoslovakia. Well, because Czechoslovakia is under the influence, the sphere of influence of Russia, Russia descends in with their troops, dismantles the presidency, and shuts down this Czech Republic from this Prague upspring that was taking place there. Well, so there in 1968, tremendous turmoil in America, and both for the white people, both for the African American, both for the marginalized. Everybody was experiencing some sense of challenge. Well, along comes Richard Milhous Nixon, who declares this victory in 1968 simply because of this group of people he calls the silent majority, those who are the housewives and the husbands who don't speak up much in politics, don't go out and demand their rights to be heard in the protests or the violence, but just the everyday American. Well, some people say that the silent majority is basically the white, the privileged, and the landowners of America is who these silent majority people were. And this is unique that once he came into office, we see Richard Nixon with a desire to pay closer attention to international affairs and less attention and desire to keep the Great Society and LBJ's programs moving forward. And so his idea was concerned with more of a stable world order than it was this idea that American ideals of democracy should be pressed forward. We saw that after World War II. We saw that with Woodrow Wilson. We saw that with Eisenhower. We saw that with early stages of Kennedy. All of these presidents were trying to develop how, democracy is the best form of governance of its people in this Cold War with Russia. And here you have Nixon saying, let's look at this a little bit differently, and maybe we should have another mindset in our hands. So here you see Richard Milhous Nixon from California, gaining the vote of California, having the silent majority and the suburban neighborhoods of Southern California on his side, does usher in his capacity to becoming our president of America at that time. Well, there's a second thing. Well, once in power, he begins to develop this idea of pragmatic conservatism, meaning someone's got to pay for all these programs, and it isn't going to be the American people. So Nixon made it a point to begin dismantling many of the programs that LBJ had put forward and worked hard at agreeing. And then with that, he began cutting programs on the war on poverty, eliminating programs that he felt were over costly, and keeping people, predominantly marginalized people, with a hand out rather than a hand up, if you will. And so he did some unique things there that didn't cause people to go, what you're doing is wrong. He did a unique, tricky thing. He said, why do we have all this money coming into the federal government, where then the federal government distributes these things out as though they know better? Why don't we let each state determine what their needs are, and we will send them money for them to come up with their own plans? And so he called this like a revenue sharing, or transferring the federal tax revenues to the states. A brilliant strategy on his part, because what did this do? It allowed the states, who normally were frustrated because of the Great Society and all of the choices that it took away from them, it now gave them choices about how they can better spend the taxes at hand. What did it also do? It helped assure him of those who were strong states advocates to keep voting for him when it comes back for re-election. At the same time, he also didn't want to lose sight of the voices of the counterculture and the voices of the new left, who are advocating for changes of respecting our environment and protections for the worker. So he started the EPA, he started the OSHA, and these programs are still in place today, where our government is doing certain things to create protections. For instance, here you see in Virginia, a chloride factory there on the edges of a river that I forget the name of the river off the top of my head, but dumping all of that chloride into the streams and rivers. Here you see in Cleveland in the Cayuga River. Look at that tar that was just smudge was put into that river. Now if you were to go visit the Cayuga, it would look as though you can go fishing in it, courtesy of the EPA. Right around the corner from us in Riverside, as a matter of fact, there was this thing called drawing a blank right now. I should have written those notes down. It was something with the water tables, and starts with the letter S. I'm so sorry, I don't have those notes in front of me. But these water pits, Strongfellow acid pits, infiltrated the water table of this area of Riverside, and the government stepped in and demanded the companies to begin cleaning these things up at their own costs. And so a very interesting thing to calm the new left, and also those who were the counterculturists who were interested in protecting the environment at this time. Another program that Nixon was doing is he supported this idea of benign neglect, meaning, you know what, let's not keep forcing this integration. It's creating more problems in the South and creating problems in even every state. So this idea of, for instance, busing. What if we just let each state determine what they think would be the best effect, rather than the federal government dictating this? Well, this was good on one hand, especially if you were people in power and if you were white, but this was a definite step backward for many African Americans or other marginalized people groups. For Nixon and the president say, you know, we're just going to kind of let the states do their own thing. We're not going to force and enforce what Earl Warren is demanding that we do based on the Supreme Court at that time. So very definite slap in the face, and the president's attempt to curtail the power of Earl Warren and the decisions that they had made under Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson as president, if you remember. He also talked about this new idea of affirmative action, not new, but let's fine tune it. And he really challenged this idea of black capitalism, which is essentially, why don't we allow businesses who are predominantly owned by black African Americans an opportunity to get loans, or opportunity to hire employees, opportunity to be moved to the upper levels of federal jobs. For instance, maybe building bridges was a new thing in Alabama. And so if a African American company owned predominantly by African Americans puts their name in to build those bridges, they will be pushed to the top of that list simply because of their background. This is what he called affirmative actions that got a lot of support from the unions, because it challenged the unions and it challenged the workplaces to say, you know what, maybe for every, if there's 3% of your workforce is Hispanic, why aren't you hiring 3% more per year to keep those numbers in balance, or even hiring more than that? So it's a unique approach to what he was doing. And then one of the last things, for the sake of time, I want to talk about under Nixon is his idea of the 26th Amendment. And what is this? He's like, hey, if we can have young men and women going over and fighting in wars for us and willing to die for us, why is it that they cannot vote? And so in 1971, all states, over 2/3 of the states, ratified to change the Constitution, lowering the voting age to 18. Why was this significant? Well, it's a link to Vietnam and the legacy of that, and it also gave the young people an opportunity to kind of have a say in how our government was run, whether it was done effectively or ineffectively during that time. So here's an example of what Richard Nixon was doing as a way to gain the African American experience and African American vote as he continued to run for his second term of office. I highlighted it for you there. He says, because black capitalism is the black power in the best sense of the word. And again, he had always used this phrase, it's not a handout, but a hand up. And this seemed to resonate with most American people. Now, President Nixon also, in addition to looking, in the government and the practices to change, he also had a deep, deep sense of vision for what was happening globally. And so one of the things of his legacy, he is known for thawing out the Cold War. And he did some unique things of approaching this. First of all, Nixon and his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, really understood the idea of gamesmanship, if you will. And so what he did is Nixon and Kissinger began working kind of backdoor channels between China and Russia, and Kissinger worked out an agreement where China will be acknowledged in the United Nations for the first time in 22 years that they've asked to do this. And when Russia hears that we're making agreements with China, they're like, hey, Brezhnev's saying, why don't you come over, Nixon, and visit us so we can have conversations about this? Why was this taking place? Well, Nixon and Kissinger both knew that even though they're communists, the Russians and the Chinese want nothing to do with each other. They distrust each other, and they have a different philosophy of how communism is looked and experienced. And so it was a brilliant strategy of this détente, of using adversaries to gain a foothold of conversation between basically two world powers that we should have been concerned about. What was the result of China? Is that they are now become members of the United Nations. We now become trade partners with them. We begin exchanging students and experiencing a thawing of relations with them. At the same time, Soviet Union and Brezhnev begin coming together and talking about this SALT treaty, the Strategic Arms Limiting Treaty. That was really a good step towards reducing how many nuclear weapons we had, not only on land pointed at each other, but also in subs. Now, you need to realize that SALT treaty was only for 5 years, but at least it was a good step in that time. Now, the ultimate thing that we need to be mindful of is that Nixon and Kissinger kind of left this mindset of what Eisenhower and Kennedy and Johnson were advocating for, is we're protecting everything about capitalism and democracy. And he's like, you know what? Let's forget those ideologies and let's just do the bigger thing. What is that? We need trade and we need jobs. And when we trade with countries, often those countries become our friends. And so that was a unique shift and take that they had here. So here you see, President Nixon playing ping pong there with the Chinese premier. And there you see Nixon shaking hands with Brezhnev and with missiles behind their back. And there you see, actually, the bottom right corner is the next electoral presidential-elect trying to convince Nixon how this is a bad deal and a bad shakedown of sorts. So we need to recognize that although Nixon and Kissinger were brilliant in China and were brilliant in terms of Russia, where they were not so brilliant was this idea of the Middle East. And why was there still problems in the Middle East? It has a lot to do with how Eisenhower and his doctrine had carved up and had seen the roles that Middle East would play. And in a prior lectures, if you remember, I talked about the 6-year war when the Egypt and Syrians attacked Israel in the Yom Kippur War that lasted essentially for 6 days. And what was the result of that? Well, America defended Israel in that, and Russia defended Egypt and Syria on that, and ultimately we both of our U.S. and Russia come together and demand like a ceasefire. But basically, this ceasefire enabled Israel to retain chunks of land that had been part of Egypt years before. What does this do? This begins immediately triggering a Muslim versus a Jewish experience. And so here you can kind of see this cartoon on the left-hand side of how Israel feels like a little island of Judaism there in the midst of a sea of Muslim countries around them. And there they are with their barbed wire and their gun ready to defend themselves. And who's there to defend them is often America. And because of our connection, because of biblical traditions and belief in God and those types of aspects. I love the other political cartoons that you see here. You see the bottom right corner of the different European and American powers carving up who is going to do what here in the Middle East. And then there you have in the upper right-hand corner the OPEC nations, oil-producing nations, predominantly Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Kuwait, kind of holding hostage all of those other world powers there to the oil that they all desperately need in order to keep growing and thriving. Well, we now come to number 4, and this is the one that most people think of Nixon. And I hope that you come away with Nixon and Kissinger were brilliant tacticians in bringing the global world and global order together and did do some remarkable things. While at the same time, what Nixon is famous for is this thing called Watergate. So prior to his re-election for his second term, he and his cronies, they were called the plumbers, a group of secretive men that went around and broke into basic different aspects of agencies that the president had concerns with. One of them is this complex called the Watergate, a new apartment complex that was built close to downtown DC. It was kind of like the swanky place, and there were the Democratic Party offices, and it was there that they broke in to kind of steal ideas as like a game book, if you will, for the opponent to see what the president should know about their game plans in terms of up for re-election. So what I'm talking about is by this time he wins re-election in 72. Okay, this is November. But way back, 4 or 5 months before that, and even 2 to 3 years before that, he was doing some illegal practices that really forced him to kind of reveal these bad business practices and actions of the president and many of those that he had respond to him. They call this the smoking gun. Why? Because once this was discovered, it became quite readily prevalent that there were estimates that President Nixon had lied when he told the American public that he wasn't escalating the war in Vietnam, when actuality he was. And so there was a guy called the Pentagon Papers who released these documents to the media to show that no, the president was lying at the same time that he was accelerating more troops going there. They also they broke into other various offices of the FBI and other local agencies that really began to recognize that Nixon tried to do a cover-up. He offered $400,000 to these guys to say they did this all on their own, and then he said, "Hey, I'll promise to give you a pardon once I leave office for all of your wrongdoings." So this scandal finally came to light with the newspaper, the Washington Post, and Woodward and Bernstein uncovering it. That really shook Americans to the core, and the credibility that we have about the president and the government and how they treat people. So here's a little cartoon here about the different steps. It's like Monopoly. Who's going to win this game? And then you have the legacy of Nixon, that on one hand he was incredible with his foreign policy, but on the other hand his Watergate cover-up kind of took away his aspect of a long-term good legacy for himself. Well, who follows? Well, when the president recognizes that he's caught and will not have a chance to break away from this because the Supreme Court is him demanding him turn over the tapes and all these other things, he resigns from office, thus putting President Gerald Ford in as president, which interestingly enough, a year before, James Spiro Agnew, who was the real vice president of Nixon, he got himself in trouble from Michigan for some illegal bribes and everything else. And so Gerald Ford was not elected, but was kind of appointed as vice president. So now he has to become president, and they need to find another running mate to be his vice president, and that's where Rockefeller comes in to be vice president during that short-term run. What do I mean by short-term run? Well, Gerald Ford does the most dubious thing that is only remembered for in his office. What does he do? He does very little to bring about changes. He does very little to kind of build confidence. He spends 2 of his years trying to build his ticket to run for president again. But what does he do in that time? He basically pardons President Nixon for his wrongdoings. And it is this that the American people on both sides of the aisle, whether Democrat or Republican, leave a bad distaste in their mouth and like, we want nothing to do with this. Who in turn wins the election in '76 is this Georgian governor who grew up as a peanut farmer, Jimmy Carter, who was touting himself as an outsider, very similar to how Trump won his thing. And this was considered an advantage because it wasn't business as usual, lifelong politicians, but it's going to be a new guy who talked openly about his faith and talked openly about humanity and talked openly about it shouldn't be about politics. We should be using our stage as the greatest country in the world to bring about positive change, not negative change. And so Carter did try to bring a human touch and a human face to the presidency. He did try to rebroker and rewrite some of the agreements that we had with various countries. But ultimately, Jimmy Carter just did not have the chutzpah, if you will, of kind of doing double talk like most politicians would. And so instead of working with many of these countries like Russia and China, who were known to fib on this aspect or fib on that aspect, he's like, no, we have standards. We're trying to run by a higher moral compass and code. And he just stopped doing work with them. And this was kind of really a poor approach on his attempt to kind of have a high moral ground when the world at that time needed someone to get things done, not necessarily run on a moral ground. And I sound very, it sounds like such the wrong thing to say, but that's typically what the history books are saying during this time. What did Carter face that was the worst thing possible? It's this idea of the oil embargo, where they had shut down oil coming into America. What does this do? As I alluded to my opening story, gas prices shot through the roof. And when these gas prices shot through the roof, it basically caused 2 things to take place. All of our industries were oil-based, meaning they needed to have cheap access to oil. From every factory that was making widgets to every factory that was making furniture, you have to run those factories on electricity, and those electricity has to be made through oil that was brought over, and then to ship them, etc. And when the cost of oil tripled, this really caused a lot of problems for our manufacturing. What does this do? It forces many manufacturers to leave overseas, leaving the labor movement basically without anything to do. And this creates what we call the deindustrialization of the area we know as Maine, all the way down to kind of Richmond, Virginia, if you will. That for 80 plus years during the Industrial Revolution onward was the heartbeat of America. Now they call it the Rust Belt. And here's a little picture of the upper part. As you can see here, this is the Rust Belt. And now we have what's taking place is the Sun Belt. People are moving to these regions because this is where the new jobs are emerging and the new opportunities are emerging. This is where they feel like their life would be better lived. The second thing that we see under the Carter administration is this idea of stagflation. And when you have the industries closing down and an increase of unemployment, oh my gosh, we have a major, major problem at hand. First of all, stagflation is the gross domestic product is falling, meaning how many widgets Americans are making in their factories. You see a demand for those widgets both locally and abroad has gone down. And you see a huge unemployment and inflation going up at the same time. This is a recipe for disaster in any economic system. And stagflation basically caused Carter and all of the economists to sit there and scratch their head going, we don't know what to do. We've never experienced some things. Keynes didn't write about this. Galbraith didn't write about this. We don't have a textbook to follow on this, so what should we do? Well, let's blame the president for this because, basically that's what we do. Well, as a result of this, Jimmy Carter says we need to consider what OPEC is doing in active war. When they're cutting off our oil, that's taking away our jobs. When that's taking away our jobs, that's creating inflation and creating unemployment. We need to get back to work. And so he called this OPEC's action a moral equivalency of war. The local media people called it MEOW. MEOW. What does that mean? They're like, there's nothing there that says, they wanted war in response to go take out OPEC nations for doing this to America. But remember, Carter is trying to run on a morally upright position, and then to attack them over simply turning off the oil that they own in the long-term history was probably the proven best course of action. But immediately many people were frustrated with Carter for his lack of action during this time. What did he do though? Is he created this thing called the Department of Energy, which allowed America to begin using natural resources in areas and began the development of nuclear energy. And so here, if you drive through San Onofre, you'll begin to see the expansion of San Onofre, and here you see a map of everywhere across the United States where different nuclear facilities were built, reactors that were given licenses to expand or to be constructed during this time. Why? Because America needed to get off the dependency of oil. And this was his policy and his plan to do so. And the second benefit of that is that these types of jobs created new industries that were high-paying jobs in which the government kind of helped support during that time. So it was his attempt to stem off the stagflation by creating new approaches to our energy crisis during that time. Well, perils of his détente, as I alluded to earlier, he had a strong moral compass, and he recognized he did not, want to be the typical politician where he'll lie through both sides of his face. He wanted to make sure that human rights were the cornerstone of his foreign policy. I mean, Jimmy Carter, when he was retired, if you will, or was voted out of office, he got heavily involved, still to this day, Habitat for Humanity, where you build homes for people who otherwise couldn't get into a home. I mean, he is a remarkable, remarkable man whose faith and everyday experience is shown still to this day. But as a president who had a moral compass, it just seemed to kind of not work well at that time when you needed a hard-charging president rather than one that was trying to find, a compass to follow. So what he did is he kind of walked in this quagmire of choosing different governments at that time period. If they were in Iran, he supported them because they were pro-America, even though that Shah, the king of Iran, and I'll talk about that here, was definitely being repressive of the Muslims that were living there. He supported, advocated the kicking out of Chilean president. Why? Because they took over American businesses that were down there. And so it was very interesting as to who he supported and who he didn't support based on American interests. But ultimately what we can say about Carter that he did is that he handed over the keys to one of the most important financial windfalls for America, and that was the Panama Canal. America was making hundreds of thousands of dollars with every boat that came through the canal in order to save, time going around the tip. This was a very important thing, but Carter was saying, look, I know there's a lot of other areas in the globe that we're allowing repressive regimes to exist. The least that we can do is to dismantle our, I'm drawing a blank on the name of that, our imperialistic tendencies and give back to Panama what should be rightfully theirs. And so in 1999, that was officially given back. Who turned over in their grave? Oh, McKinley, President McKinley. Who turned over the grave? Teddy Roosevelt. Like, are you kidding me? What is taking place? Giving away America's prized possessions? Well, this is the legacy that Carter was trying to do and to create. Was it good? Was it bad? Well, he did some good things with the Soviet Union. He had another treaty that was allegedly signed, but it eventually kind of bombed because of Afghanistan. I'll talk about that here in a moment. He encouraged more conversations with China and basically said that Taiwan we're not going to acknowledge as the true China any longer, and this made China feel very happy about themselves. And I wish I had more time to talk about that, but I don't and want to. But the big thing that we need to be mindful of is Carter authorized the CIA, and this is an interesting thing, is that here he is trying to have a moral compass, but at the same time he uses the covert operations of the CIA to support Afghan rebels there who are fighting against the Russians. These Afghan rebels were definitely hardcore Muslims. Who were they called? The Mujahideen. Who were the Mujahideen? These turn out to be the same people who we know as the 9/11 infiltrators, with Osama bin Laden there as the early training during that time. So I find it very interesting that America in the 80s are providing weapons to the Mujahideen to fight the Soviets, who then use that technology and experience to plan attacks on America. So I'm not saying that's the legacy of Carter, but that is certainly something to be aware of. And so here you see Carter and Brezhnev, I think it is, signing the SALT Treaty #2. I love it how their pins are still using those missiles, saying they're still prevalent. They're not going away. We're just reducing the amounts of them. And then the other one is, hey, you show me how many you have, and I'll show you how many I have, and then we'll maybe come to an agreement of sorts. So here you see the Mujahideen, who are provided weapons by the Americans. Why? Because we feel they're there for humanitarian sake to defeat the Russians. When, like I said earlier, these Mujahideen eventually go on to challenge America in our with 9/11. And the challenges in the Middle East that Carter, one legacy that he can claim as his own that was very good is that he did bring together both Egypt and Israel at Camp David there in Maryland. That's a place where the president can go, like his own or her own retreat area. And for 3 weeks, these leaders came together and essentially shook hands and signed an accord that Egypt would acknowledge Israel as an official country. In exchange for that, Israel would give back to Egypt the land that they took from them during the war, the 6-year war. This was a unique accord and a definite windfall for President Carter. However, at the end of his term, and probably why he lost the election to Ronald Reagan, is Iran was given weaponry and other things in 1953 to support a king. And this king told Americans that he wants to have open and free elections, but most importantly, he will always be a loyal friend. And America was always trying to find kind of friend groups there who had oil. Iran had oil. And so in exchange for oil, for all these years, America was giving the leader, the king, the Shah of Iran, not only weapons, but paying him a handful amounts of money. Well, the Shah did not uphold the democratic principles. In fact, he used many of those weapons and monies to repress the Muslim people there, and one of them being Khomeini and others. And it was eventually a revolution occurred, and it was during this revolution that occurred that the Khomeini took over for the Shah, and then you see a return to Islamic fundamentalism. And mostly be okay, that's fine. They had a return to right of what it was, but President Carter invited the Shah, the king, to America under the guise of he needs cancer treatment, which true or not true, but that basically enabled Americans to move in to remove him, so he couldn't be brought to trial or to justice or to be hanged, whatever they wanted to do. during that time. And this frustrated the Ayatollah. What happened? They then seized the United States Embassy, taking 52 hostages. And this is here what you can see pictures of the Ayatollah Khomeini holding the hostages. In the upper right-hand corner are 52 pictures that were on every newspaper across America. And Carter didn't go out without swinging. He did try to put together an escape plan, but that escape plan did not go well, did not bode well, where 8 American soldiers and 1 Iranian, their choppers collided with some land choppers that were there, and this plan to kind of release the hostages and take them back was duped during that time. And so this definitely soured relations with Iran, and it didn't take, sadly, to Carter's dismay, his legacy was tarnished by this 52 hostages that were never returned under his watch, that Ronald Reagan, the newly elected president, had orchestrated the release of these 52 hostages on the actual inauguration day of his term in January. Did we pay off the Shah? I mean, the Ayatollah Khomeini? Did we give other reparations? You know, it's still discussed what maybe Ronald Reagan had done, but nonetheless, it did show a complete new shift of how there will be a new president on board who's not willing to sit there and negotiate anymore with these fundamentalists that had been there before. So to conclude, America in 1968 was struggling, both turmoil in our country and turmoil globally. How does this happen? Nixon turns America to veer away from the Great Society of LBJ and begins addressing the problems kind of at a smaller, systematic way at the state level. During this time, however, Nixon, it's uncovered that he's doing corrupt practices, and this causes most of America to lose confidence and favor in our political system during this time. At the same time, we see the economy struggling and very few solutions to that, and relationships with Russia and relationships with the Middle East continue to deteriorate during this time. And what is next is Ronald Reagan, and how is he going to pick up these pieces of Russia and pick up these pieces of the Middle East, and what is America going to do to kind of regain its sense of foothold in that. So with that, go Bears, keep it classy. We'll be seeing you next time.